take a look at a world map from the year 1900. You'll see the colour pink spread across the continents, from Africa to Asia, from Australia to the tiny islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That is the colour of the British Empire, an entity that occupied a quarter of the planet's surface, controlled over 400 million people, and reshaped trade, law, language, and the way humanity thinks about power. But here's the strange thing. In the year 2025, Britain is a small island with a stagnating economy, decaying infrastructure, rising inequality, and a political debate that endlessly revolves around the question of who is ruining this country. No one asks if the system itself is the problem. And this is the core paradox we need to explore on our journey today. The very ideas that created the Great British Empire are the same ideas that are now destroying Britain from within. Not by an external enemy, not by a lost war, but by a logic so deeply embedded in its culture, institutions, and political thinking that people can no longer see it. So how did that happen? To understand this, we must start with a small island that most people have never heard of. Madeira, the 15th century. When the Portuguese set foot on Madeira, they didn't come to settle. They came to exploit. The island was covered in a tropical forest, with fertile land and ideal conditions for growing sugarcane. The next decision the Portuguese made would change human history forever. They clear-cut the forests, they brought in slaves, they turned the entire island into a sugar production machine, exporting it for the European aristocracy. When the soil was depleted, and the trees could no longer grow, they simply left. This wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. When ancient empires invaded a land, they usually built upon it, settled, and lived alongside the local people. But Madeira was something entirely different. This was about seizing land, squeezing it dry of its wealth, transferring the profits back to the mother country, and then leaving behind a barren wasteland. This was the first prototype of colonialism, and England would learn this lesson very well, then take it across the world on a scale that not even the Portuguese could have imagined. But before England could conquer the world, they had to practice on their own country. And this raises a question that few people think about. Why were the English willing to do that? The answer lies in a process that began around the 16th century and lasted until the 18th century. A process with no gunshots, no wars, but one that changed the structure of English society more radically than any revolution. It was the process of land enclosure. For most of England's history, vast areas of land existed as common land. No one officially owned it, but no one was forbidden from using it. Peasants could go to the fields to plant crops, graze their livestock, gather firewood, and forage. They could feed themselves. They weren't rich, but they were self-sufficient, and this was the problem. Capitalism cannot function if people can opt out of it. If a peasant could make a living for themselves from the common land, why would they go work for a landowner for meagre wages? The English Parliament, representing the aristocracy and landowners, began to pass a series of Enclosure Acts. Piece by piece, the common lands were fenced off, declared private property, and the peasants were kicked out. With no more common land, they could no longer feed themselves. They were forced to sell their labour in exchange for money to buy food, rent a home, and purchase fuel. Economists call this process proletarianization, turning people who were once self-sufficient into people completely dependent on the market. And once they had successfully practiced this at home, the English exported this model to the entire world. This is where the story becomes complicated, in a way that a map cannot show. When the British arrived in Australia, they didn't just have a problem with the indigenous people over land. They faced a more profound challenge. Aboriginal Australians had lived on that land for tens of thousands of years. They had deep knowledge of how to survive, how to find food, how to read nature. They were completely self-sufficient. Even some British convicts who were exiled to Australia escaped into the outback. They didn't come back. They had found indigenous communities willing to take them in, teaching them how to live without depending on the colonial system. This was a crisis for the British. Not for moral reasons, but for economic ones. If people could support themselves outside the system, who would go to work on the plantations? The colonial authorities' answer was to destroy that self-sufficiency, restricting the movement of indigenous people, banning traditional activities, declaring that the indigenous way of using the land was not recognised under European law, and therefore the land belonged to the Crown, separate children from their parents to erase generational knowledge. What seemed like senseless cruelty actually had a very cold and clear economic logic. If people possessed the knowledge of how to live self-sufficiently, the very existence of that knowledge is a threat to the system. Not because of what they might do, but because the presence of an alternative diminishes the system's power over everyone else. But this is what we really need to stop and think about. How could the British justify all of this to themselves? This was a nation that called itself Christian, with a religion that teaches all human beings are equal in the eyes of God. How can you believe that? While simultaneously running a system that caused tens of millions of deaths, the answer is you have to construct an entire ideological architecture to turn what is morally impossible into something that seems self-evident. And this is the ideological machine that the British built, piece by piece. The first piece was the theory of land ownership. John Locke, one of the most influential philosophers in the history of Western thought, argued that land only becomes legitimate property when a person improves it with their labour. If Indigenous people use the land in traditional ways, according to this logic, they didn't truly own it. And if they don't own it, then taking it isn't theft, it's improvement. The second piece was the theory of civilizational stages. By the 19th century, British and European scholars had constructed a theoretical framework in which all civilizations progress through stages of development from low to high, from communal to individual, from irrational to rational, and Europe, naturally, stood at the top of that ladder. From this, the philosopher John Stuart Mill could openly argue that the harsh rule over barbarous peoples was necessary and even benevolent, as it helped them advance to higher stages of civilization. The third piece was pseudoscientific racial classification. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach measured skulls, catalogued physical traits, and constructed a racial hierarchy with European whites at the apex. He called them Caucasians, a word still in use today, even though actual Caucasians are from the Caucasus region and look nothing like what Blumenbach described. From this arose social Darwinism, which turned the world into a struggle for survival, where the victory of the strong was a law of nature, and European dominance was simply the result of natural selection. And the final piece, no less important, was nationalism. This was the tool to solve a very real domestic problem. The British working class were not the beneficiaries of the empire. They worked in the mines, in the factories, living in terrible conditions. They had every reason to align with other workers around the world, not with the aristocracy that was exploiting them. Nationalism solved this by merging two groups with opposing interests into a single, shared identity. If you were British, the empire's success was your success. The nation's greatness was your greatness. You weren't an exploited person. You were part of the greatest empire in history. Put it all together, and you have a complete ideological system. Racial hierarchy explained who could be dominated. Individualism explained why the poor deserved their poverty. Nationalism explained why global domination was justified. And once these ideas were embedded in law, in the education system, in institutions, and finally in the culture, they were no longer just an ideology. They became the way the world worked. They became invisible. And this is the most important thing we need to understand in this whole story. After World War II, the empire collapsed. But the ideas did not. Look at what happened to other empires when they collapsed throughout history. Nazi Germany collapsed in ashes, and the Nuremberg trials. The Japanese Empire fell to the sound of atomic bombs. The Ottoman Empire dissolved after its defeat in World War I. Each case was a clear and painful moment of shattering, a historical event one could point to and say, "This is the end point. The old world is dead. We must rebuild from scratch." Sociologists call this a foundational rupture. And when it happens, a society is forced to ask itself the question, who are we now? Germany rebuilt itself into an export-led industrial state. Japan became a manufacturing and technological superpower. France repositioned itself as the leader of Europe. The fall of the British Empire was different. It happened quietly, slowly. There was no single, clear moment that people could point to and say, this is the end. The colonized nations gradually gained their independence, but in Britain, everything seemed to stay the same. The monarchy was still there. Parliament still operated as before. The legal system, the state apparatus, nothing fundamentally changed. And that's precisely the problem. When the institutions were built to manage a global empire, designed to regulate the flow of wealth from the colonies to the metropole, built on a foundation of domination and dependency. Then when the empire disappears, nobody changes those institutions. They continue to operate as if the conditions of empire still exist. And this creates a very strange, collective, psychological state. If, for a long period of history, your culture and ideology constantly remind you that Britain is the pinnacle of human civilization, that the British are the architects of world order, that British dominance is natural and indisputable, then when the decline begins, you don't have the cognitive tools to understand it as a structural problem. All you can think is, someone is messing things up. And this is where we begin to see the wounds of empire appearing on Britain itself. After the financial crisis of 2008, the real wages of British workers stagnated for years on end. Public services were cut under the name of austerity policies. Many areas in the north of England, the old industrial towns, fell into a state of structural poverty. Children were suffering from malnutrition in a country that once ruled a quarter of the world. But the political answer was never, "There's something wrong with the system." The answer was always, "Someone is managing it wrong." Brexit is the clearest example of this logic. The central slogan of the Brexit campaign was "Take back control." This phrase assumes something very specific. It assumes that Britain is losing control, that its decline is an anomaly, that someone or something is taking away what rightfully belongs to Britain. In this case, the culprit was the European Union. No one in the mainstream political debate questioned whether the idea of Brexit itself was the problem. When the results were worse than expected, the answer was, "We did Brexit wrong. We need more competent people to do Brexit." The logic was never questioned. Only the execution was criticised. And then the narrative shifted to immigration. Once again, the problem was defined as Britain having lost control of its borders. No one asked why immigration rates were rising in the context of growing global inequality, why the domestic labour market couldn't create enough good jobs for its own population, or about the links between British foreign policy and refugee crises. Instead, the question was always, who is letting this happen? But here is the deepest paradox we need to recognise. While Britain was talking about taking back control, the real control of the British economy had quietly shifted into the hands of America, not with guns, but with capital. After the Second World War, Britain took on massive debts from the United States to rebuild. American private companies began buying up British assets. ExxonMobil and Chevron owned stakes in North Sea oil and gas extraction. Blackstone and BlackRock bought up rental properties and student dormitories. Amazon dominates retail. Walmart took over the supermarket chain through Asda, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing. Supply weapons and defense technology that Britain can no longer produce itself. Every bill you pay, every time you go to the supermarket, every transaction in the economy, money flows out of Britain and to shareholders in America. This is precisely the structure of colonialism, only now Britain is in the position of the colony. The Americans learned something the British never understood. To have an empire, you don't need to rule everywhere directly. You just need to control it economically. Britain was one of the first test cases for this doctrine. And this is where we need to ask another question. Is there a way out? If we look around the world, we see many different models. Norway built a national sovereign wealth fund from its oil, using investment returns to fund public services and plan its economic future. Singapore owns 90% of its land through the state, and 80% of its people live in affordable, high-quality public housing, while still maintaining a strong free market economy. China refused to let the market run completely free and uses the state to coordinate infrastructure, finance, and industry toward long-term goals, creating the world's largest high-speed rail network in 3 decades. None of these models are seriously discussed in British politics. Instead, the only model that is regularly praised is Dubai, and this reveals a lot about how ideological filters still operate. Dubai is built on extremely low tax rates, lax labour regulations, constantly rising asset prices, and a dependence on capital from the wealthy coming from elsewhere. Dubai doesn't create much domestic value. It attracts the wealthy who have built their fortunes elsewhere. This is a parasitic economic model, not a developmental one. Meanwhile, while Singapore and China have genuinely concerning issues with human rights and freedom of speech, Dubai itself has similar problems with labour rights and controlling expression. And yet, Dubai is welcomed into the conversation, while Singapore and China are excluded for being deemed to have incompatible value systems. The truth isn't a matter of morality. The truth is that Dubai doesn't challenge Britain's current economic worldview, while Singapore and China do. And this is the crux of the whole story. When an ideology is embedded deeply enough into a culture and its institutions, it no longer needs to justify itself. It protects itself by making alternatives invisible, seem unfeasible, or categorizing them as dangerous. What makes this situation particularly complex is that Britain has never had a moment of reckoning, a true confrontation with its past. Germany had Nuremberg. It was forced to look directly at what it had done, to name it, to punish those responsible, and to rebuild its national identity on a different foundation. That doesn't erase history, but it creates a clear break between the past and the present. Britain has no such break. In the 1950s to the 1970s, during a state campaign called Operation Legacy, Britain destroyed numerous colonial records documenting torture, mass detentions, collective punishment, and racial violence. This means it wasn't just a failure to acknowledge, but an active erasure of the evidence. And this teaches a profound lesson to the entire society, not just about politics, but about how people treat one another. When those in the highest positions of power never admit their mistakes and never take responsibility, it sends an implicit message to the entire society. Admitting mistakes is a sign of weakness. Accountability undermines power. When things go wrong, find someone else to blame. And if this is the behavior modeled by society's leaders, doesn't it seep into the way individuals conduct themselves? Does a society that cannot say, "we were wrong," at the highest level, produce individuals who are less capable of saying it to one another? And if so, does that contribute to the growing loneliness, isolation, and lack of trust in modern British society? This is the true cost of empire. Not just poverty, war, or inequality, but the loss of the ability to live with mutual accountability. But the story isn't a simple, one-sided tragedy. There's something important we often overlook when we talk about the legacy of empire. The British working class were not the architects of colonialism. They were victims of the same system, just in a different form. While the aristocracy drank tea from India on expensive china, the working class turned tea into a completely different ritual. A cup offered to a neighbour to talk, grieve, laugh, and find respite from the stresses of life. When the ruling class oppressed them, workers organised unions, built strike funds, and held protests. The British people frequently boycotted sugar from slave plantations in support of the abolitionist movement. They won many struggles. British comedy, one of this country's greatest cultural contributions, is built entirely on satirising the powerful, mocking the self-important, and exposing the hypocrisy of the upper class. The real culture of the British people, not the one imposed from above, but the one created from the ground up, has always been built in resistance to that imposition. Punk, grime, football, political, comedy. These are things born from resistance, not from compliance. What does that mean for the future? Perhaps Britain doesn't need to answer the question of empire by trying to reclaim its lost status. Perhaps the right question isn't, how can Britain be great again? But what does Britain want to be in a world where domination is no longer an option? That question has not yet been seriously asked in British politics. And until it is, the debate will continue to circle the same loop of logic. Things are going wrong, someone is to blame, and we must reclaim what was lost. But if what was lost wasn't power, but the illusion of power, then the question becomes, what happens when that illusion can finally no longer be sustained? Will Britain face the reckoning it has avoided for nearly a century, or will it continue to drift in a question that is never answered? That is a question the map cannot answer.